Let's kick things off with a pretty bold claim, one that might even sound surprising. When you line up all the books from the ancient world, the New Testament is one of the best preserved in all of history. Now hold on, this isn't an argument based on faith. We're going to set theology completely aside and look at this like a historian, just digging into the hard evidence.
You know, when a historian gets their hands on an ancient work, doesn't matter if it's Plato, Caesar, or the Apostle Paul, their first question isn't, hey, is this story true? Nope. It's something way more basic. They ask, are the words we're reading today actually the same words that were first written down thousands of years ago?
This whole idea has a name, textual reliability. And all it's asking is, how good was the copying process over all those centuries? It's a historical standard, a scholarly question about transmission, not truth. And it's the key to understanding why the New Testament is such an absolutely fascinating case study. So what happens when we put the New Testament under that historical microscope? Well, the evidence we find is, frankly, it's not normal. It's a massive outlier compared to pretty much every other text from the ancient world. And the reasons for that are pretty cool.
The whole case really rests on three main pillars. The copies we have are unusually early, crazy close to when the originals were written. They are unusually abundant. I mean, we have a staggering number of them. And they are unusually widespread, found all over the ancient world. So let's break that down.
All right, first up, just how early are these copies? For most ancient authors, we have to wait centuries, sometimes more than 1,000 years for our first copy to show up. With the New Testament, we have manuscripts that were being passed around when the apostles' grandkids could have still been alive.
And we've got some amazing specific examples. Take a look at P52. It's a little scrap of John's Gospel, dated to around 125 AD. This tiny piece of papyrus, found way over in Egypt, proves the Gospel of John was being copied hundreds of miles from where it was probably written, just a few decades later. That's huge. And it's not some lucky find. We have P46 with most of Paul's letters, and nearly complete Gospels like P66 and P75 from around that same time.
And that brings us to the second pillar, abundance. And folks, this is where the numbers just get kind of crazy. When you add up all the Greek manuscripts, plus all the early translations into Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and more, you get to over 24,000 manuscript copies. For any text from the ancient world, that number is absolutely unheard of.
And here's the kicker. These thousands of manuscripts weren't all stacked up in one dusty library. They were found scattered all across the known world, from Egypt to Syria to Rome. And this is so important because it means that no one person or group could have systematically changed the entire text. I mean, think about it. You'd have to track down thousands of copies across 3 continents in a bunch of different languages and change them all without anyone noticing. It's a historical impossibility.
So the evidence is early and there's a ton of it. But to really get a sense of how unique this is, you got to see it side by side with the other heavy hitters of the ancient world. You know, the works that every historian relies on, no questions asked.
Okay, just look at this chart. It really says it all. For Plato, we're waiting about 1,200 years for our first good copies, and we have, what, maybe 20? For Caesar's Gallic Wars, a foundational text of Roman history, there's a 900-year gap and only about 10 manuscripts. 10! Now look back at the New Testament. A time gap of mere decades and over 24,000 manuscripts. It's not even in the same league. There is simply no comparison.
But hold on a second. You might be thinking, wait a minute. If there are 24,000 copies made by hand, doesn't that just mean there are 24,000 chances for scribes to make mistakes? And you know what? That's a fantastic question, and it leads right to what scholars call the paradox of variance.
So here's the paradox. Yes, more manuscripts mean you're going to find more tiny differences. A spelling mistake here, a different word order there. Those are called variants. But, and this is the crucial part, having all those manuscripts is also the solution to the problem. It's like having 1,000 witnesses to an accident. The more witnesses you have, the more little differences you'll hear in their stories, right? But you also have way more data to piece together what actually happened.
And this isn't just guesswork. The people who do this, called textual critics, are basically text detectives. They follow a rigorous method, asking questions like, which version is found in the oldest copies? Which version best explains how all the other mistakes could have happened? And which version shows up in manuscripts from totally different places, like Egypt and Italy? This process lets them rebuild the original text with an incredibly high degree of confidence.
So after all this painstaking detective work, what's the verdict? What do the experts who spend their entire lives studying these manuscripts actually agree on? Well, the consensus is pretty stunning.
The late Bruce Metzger, who is an absolute legend in this field, estimated that over 99% of the New Testament text is established beyond any reasonable doubt. That tiny fraction left over for debate doesn't affect a single core story or belief.
And just to be clear, this isn't some conclusion only reached by scholars of faith. Bart Ehrman, a very prominent critic who has written a lot about these variants, agrees. He acknowledges that the vast majority of differences between the manuscripts are trivial. We're talking spelling, synonyms, or word order. The essential message is not in question.
And we have powerful proof that the text was locked in from very early on. By the 4th century, we find these magnificent, nearly complete Bibles, like the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. The fact that the texts in these huge books are so overwhelmingly similar proves that a stable, authoritative version of the New Testament was already settled long before they were copied. So, let's bring it all home. When you consider the early dates, the sheer number of copies, and that wide geographic spread, and you compare that to any other ancient work, the conclusion is really hard to avoid. Purely on the basis of textual preservation, the New Testament is one of the most reliable and best attested documents from the ancient world. Period.
The historical evidence shows us that we can be incredibly confident that we know what the original authors of the New Testament wrote. So the question for us today really isn't, can we trust the transmission of the words anymore? The far more interesting question is, now that we have it, what do we do with it?